Welcome to Unlayered. We are joined today by Kel of Messari. Kel is a researcher at Messari that covers a lot of things, one of which is Solana. And in many ways, I had a similar type of role in my previous job at Galaxy, where I heavily featured that ecosystem. And so when I saw your report, Kel, it reminded me a lot of what I put out a year ago, last May, where perhaps there's a lot of FUD about this ecosystem. But if you really look at the data, you look at what people are building, what they're doing, you find a different story. Tell us about your journey into the Solana ecosystem.
Thank you, and appreciate the invite. And I'm super glad to be here and spend some time, hopefully, learning something new about Solana with the two of you today. So, yeah, man, I actually had a somewhat roundabout path towards getting to, I guess, my current opinion on
Mm-hmm.
Solana. I was a proud hater for some
Oh,
time.
man.
Yeah, totally. So I definitely bought into a lot of the more negative kind of stereotypical narratives that Solana has carried over the years, centralization, bad design, all of these other things. And that was mostly the case until breakpoint of 2022, so last year. And going into that, I just decided I was going to have an open mind, and see what I would find. And worst comes to worst, hey, at least I'm in Lisbon, right? So
Of course.
that was kind of my mindset going into that. And what I found honestly shocked me and completely changed the course of how I think about it, and in turn, kind of changed the course of how I, went about my research, culminating in the piece that you mentioned. So
Yeah. It's so funny. There is like an uncanny amount of similarities between my journey into Solana specifically and yours, where it reversed it one full year back. So breakpoint 2021, basically I just started at Galaxy. I was there for a few months, just covering mostly NFTs and apps and stuff like that. And breakpoint was happening, and we needed to send someone from our team there. And the only reason I ended up going was because my coworker wanted to go to a concert in Vegas that same weekend. So I was like, all right, yeah, I'll go to Breakpoint. I had no idea what Solana was really. I mean, I heard of it and like saw the NFT drops and stuff, but I didn't really dig in. But to your point, as soon as I stepped foot into Lisbon, and that was 2021, so obviously bull market and Sol is ripping to like 250 or plus. I just saw the energy. I saw tons of people super excited about it. I saw the builders. I talked to people building cool apps in the ecosystem. And most importantly, I was able to juxtapose this with, because at the time I was staying at this hotel called the Corinthian, and a CosmoCon 2021 was there. And so I could actually compare almost like an A/B test. All right, here's this other ecosystem everyone speaks so highly of, Cosmos. They had like 250 people total, and then Breakpoint had 5,000 people. CosmoCon was tiny. It was very nerdy and kind of, not to say anything bad about the ecosystem. It's a great ecosystem, but it's just comparing those two specific conferences, it was just night and day. And I knew there was some energy there that, kind of putting away the FUD and the criticisms, there was something good about this ecosystem that just made me curious and want to learn more.
yeah, definitely. I mean, talk about energy. That was the exact kind of takeaway that I had, which was incredible to contrast to the ensuing fallout that happened the day after Breakpoint ended in
Yeah.
2022, which was the mighty collapse of FTX.
Hmm.
But that for me was kind of like the flashing sign, like you got to go for this thing, because I had just come to this conclusion that, hey, my opinion, which is at that time the consensus opinion that, Solana's trash, etc., that
Hmm.
opinion's actually wrong. And that's the area of greatest opportunity, is when you hold an opinion, you realize it's wrong, and you also have the same opinion as consensus. That in
Yep.
turn means that the consensus opinion is wrong. And so that's obviously a large area of opportunity. And it had just widened massively because of the FTX thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Bottomed out to like $8 or something like that. Crazy. Crazy.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? On Bankless, they always talk about front running the opportunity, and obviously predominantly talking about Ethereum, whereas it doesn't feel that way anymore, does it? It feels very much that is the consensus view. And it really feels like now this is the podcast which is trying to front run the opportunity, because, as you say, the imbalance between I think what we feel we know about Solana the tech, Solana the ecosystem, the builders, is very, very different to what mainstream crypto seems to think about it. Albeit it seems to be changing last couple of weeks. Have you felt in the air that there's been a shift?
Definitely, definitely. I mean, I like to, pretend in my head that, after my piece came out, was like, oh, Solana is good. But obviously, there's been, a plethora of different teams, people, your podcasts, of course, like the Solana team, all the teams building on top of Solana. And then on top of that, you have researchers like myself, you have traders, you have all of these different people championing the ecosystem, and it definitely does seem to have created a change in sentiment for sure.
By the way, who does the graphics at Messari? I used to have to do them all myself, man. It was a lot of work. Like, how do these graphics work? What I'm talking about is this one where you're comparing Solana and Ethereum, and you kind of, and I think Messari is famous for this. You have all these like kind of sub metrics, and out of 5, basically, you rate each category of performance,
Hmm.
cost,
Hmm.
composability, so on and so forth. I think that's a great way to compare these two ecosystems that are often compared to each other on Twitter. Tell us about like kind of the high level takeaways from that.
Yeah, sure. So the graphic creator is yours truly. That one's all me.
There it is. Yeah,
Um,
love it.
so I appreciate the praise for sure. But yeah, basically, what I wanted to do is to try and, of course, opinions on these different chains and ecosystems can ultimately be very qualitative, very subjective, and very kind of wishy-washy. And the scoring I did is also very subjective, but it at least tried to put some kind of numbers to those subjective assessments so that people can kind of see, hey, I'm not just saying Solana might be better or within range of Ethereum on these things arbitrarily. I'm trying to rate them and kind of at least provide a baseline or a framework that people can say, hey, I agree that you think that Solana should score higher on composability, or hey, I disagree in this area or that area. And so the high level takeaway from that chart in particular was, at least for me, that while Ethereum utterly dominated Solana in terms of what I would call present criteria or things that are true today,
Yeah.
Solana had a significant edge in what I would call forward facing criteria or things that might be relevant tomorrow.
Yeah. So, kind of just on that point, because I think it's so hard for, especially on crypto Twitter, to get out of the present moment and not get caught up in today's narratives. And I think that's one of the reasons why Solana is so criticized, and kind of even just highlighting one of the points you make with this chart, where liquidity wise, Solana's 1.5 and Ethereum's 4.5, which I think it's a fair assessment. And in a world where there's airdrop season and there's not that many apps outside of finance and DeFi and things like that, it seems to matter. So how do you even like think about, to your point, which blockchain's well suited for the future? Because it's so hard for us to even see what that mattering, like performance mattering and liquidity, maybe changing over time or not mattering as much.
I guess the way I see it is my baseline assumption is that none of the end state users of crypto generally are using crypto today, right? And those end state users have a disproportionate impact on the vibrancy of each ecosystem, on the adoption level of each ecosystem, and in turn, the liquidity and all these other things. And so while like Solana's current liquidity is far outweighed by Ethereum's current liquidity, I don't think that any like super major financial instruments, of course, you're starting to see maybe a little bit of it now, real world assets kind of picking up, but it's really a drop in the bucket compared to, I think, at least what most people in the industry are sort of imagining. And so with that in mind, even though the overall score was slightly lower for Solana than Ethereum in that graphic, most of the things that at least I believe give crypto a chance of attracting those sort of end state users were more in Solana's favor. And so those are things like performance, composability, asset like minting costs, etc.
I just noticed as well, so you are including rollups within the Ethereum side of this. And so even with the rollups, you've put performance, which is TPS and latency, at 3 out of 5, basically, and Solana at 4.5 out of 5. And yeah, low costs and composability at 3.5. And yeah, higher on Solana. So yeah, it's interesting. Is that your view, even once the layer 2 level is fully built out? Is that your view on where it's going to end up, or is that your view on where it is today?
I think it's a mixture of both. And so when we look at like a thing I don't like that happens a lot is people will compare the current status of one ecosystem or one project to the future optimal status of another. I think it's fair to project into the future, right? But do like and like. So in the case of the performance and low fees, when I look at today, Solana clearly does more transactions than the whole Ethereum ecosystem combined, L2s combined. Um, and cost wise, we've seen many times now that even what I would call relatively low spikes in demand, so stuff from like meme coin season, ultimately that's really like maybe 5 to 10 coins tops that are driving these volume spikes, and you see massive fee spikes on ETH1, and you also see fairly sizable fee spikes on, optimistic rollups like Arbitrum, Optimism, etc., where you're getting to, in some cases even like over $1 fees or more, which again is off of a relatively small spike in demand. And so you can imagine if one of these bigger kind of, NASDAQ or Twitter or whatever, some insert Web2 thing you think is good is on chain, then the spike in fees would be enormous. And so that's on the present side. And then on the future side, you compare something like there's kind of competing visions in the L2 space as to what is actually even going to be the end state. Further development on the optimistic rollup side. There's also the ZK rollups, there's volitions, there's validiums, there's different data availability structures, etc. But when I compare all of those to what Solana would be able to achieve in its ideal case with something like Fire Dancer, it still kind of ends up weighing out where, Fire Dancer, they've tested over 1 million TPS all in one system, right? And so that is, at least to my knowledge, the best of my ability, still a pretty big gap between, that case. And I think Vitalik has even been quoted saying that at end state, ETH would be processing 100K transactions per second. So
Yeah. And I'm just looking at one of your tables here where it's actually really useful to kind of compare not just like Ethereum and the rollups, but also, all right, Twitter's 24K tweets per second during like the World Cup final surge, and
mhm.
Visa's 1.7K transactions per second, 65K capacity on NASDAQ, 20K current average trades per second. And so now we juxtapose that with, theoretically Fired Answer, like up to 1.2 million max theoretical TPS, and Solana currently, depending on what you count, 4K ish TPS, but then a lot of those are votes, so maybe it's 500 true TPS. But I guess the point is that is the future we have to skate towards for this technology to be useful for a lot of people, or those like Twitter's, Visa's, NASDAQs of the world. And in fact, Solana used to be, they would build themselves as the NASDAQ at blockchain speed or something like that. I think I have that inverted. But I guess the point you're making now is that even if like this end state for Ethereum is achieved, like their kind of caps are not even in the same ballpark as what maybe a Fire Dancer could do with Solana.
That's certainly what it seems like, at least is, as far as you can project from today. A lot of things can change. And, if we go back 3, 4 years to 2017, 18, even 2019, the vision that people had even for Ethereum or even for Bitcoin. Some parts played out, other parts didn't. There were pivots, et cetera, et cetera. So
Totally. It's so important to contextualize performance with, I guess, demand for block space. And like the example I always go back to in my head is in like the last bear market, 20 like 18, 19, when people truly didn't care about crypto. I would consider ETH in my head was like the cheap chain. We're like, oh yeah, I could just send someone some money for like 15 cents. And like Bitcoin was the expensive one. And like we had this issue at Shapeshift where we would pay like affiliates in Bitcoin, and the fees would be so high, we would have to batch them and then send the transaction. And we would actually prefer ETH because it was so cheap. And then, the next bull run happens and DeFi happens, NFTs happen, and now ETH is the expensive chain. And so much can change in just a few years with new apps and new usage. And then the L2s came out as a solution to that. But I think, yeah, like to your point, like we got to compare where we're going and where we're at today to actually understand performance. And like those goalposts can change so quickly too.
Yeah, and just you were just quoting numbers, and we talked about it in a previous podcast. But when it's 20,000 current average trades per second, of course, in TradFi, you've also got the high frequency traders placing canceling trades at like 20-1 ratio. So suddenly, that's like 250,000 transactions per second if you include the cancellations potentially. And of course, crypto is a bit like the internet. It's not just replacing or displacing the previous technologies and what previously existed. It's creating brand new markets. It's it's producing a market for everything, for brand new assets, for existing assets which didn't previously have markets. So you feel like those numbers are only going to go up, and the likelihood is, we're probably going to need millions of TPS at some point. So if Vitalik is saying 100,000 TPS, and they're trying to be, if you like, the DeFi chain, it just seems incongruous. I struggle to get my head around how that can be, but I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? And do you have any thoughts just generally on DeFi and the direction that you see it going?
sure, yeah. I mean, I feel like to your point, the reason why a lot of people kind of can hold these two beliefs at the same time, like one, crypto's market expansionary and it can take significant market share, not just from finance, create new markets and all of these, very big, ambitious things, but also simultaneously, Ethereum with its current constraints can also service that demand despite there being a big gap between what that demand kind of insinuates and where Ethereum can be, even in the end state. I feel like the big reason for that is crypto is very like, it, despite all of the dreams, it can be very backwards looking and path dependent, meaning like if something has gone a certain way, because of the constant pricing and the amount of attention that that drives towards like recent history, recency bias, people will just expect something to continue playing out the way that it just played out. And they'll anchor heavily towards like that recent history. And so with respect to DeFi, what did we see? DeFi summer, that's on Ethereum, and this huge boom in TVL that's mostly on Ethereum. And which chains have retained TVL since then? It's mostly Ethereum or L2s on top of Ethereum. And so people kind of go from that data point and then extrapolate out, all right, well, then therefore Ethereum must be the DeFi chain, or the Ethereum ecosystem must be the DeFi ecosystem, and other chains have to fight for everything else. But when I compare that to sort of the earlier point that we all agreed upon, which is most of the end state users and the end state use cases, they aren't here. And those people don't respect the path dependency and the anchoring of what happened in the past because they weren't there. They're not holding those bags, like they just don't care. And that's how people, at least from my understanding of the history, can kind of end up offsides in crypto. And the biggest case of that is something like Bitcoin. A lot of Bitcoiners, we probably saw the Ethereum ICO and all of this development on Ethereum, but for various reasons, a lot of philosophical ones, perhaps, they decided that they were going to kind of shun this thing. And when it was having issues, that was like their validation. But then what happened in the end? They missed a big opportunity. And so it's not to say that there's a guarantee that happens with Solana, but that's kind of the similar kind of dynamic I see playing out.
When the bull run of 2021 happened, we got, to your point, like a new class of users. Let's call them the NFT users. And none of them, a lot of them didn't even acknowledge or understand what Bitcoin was. Like they just came in through Ethereum, and there was no concept of like this this thing before it. There was no interest in it. Very few of them even had Bitcoin wallets. And so I think we've seen it play out before. It would make sense for that to play out again as like a new class of users comes through some vector. Maybe it's a crypto gaming app that uses a different L1 like Solana. Maybe it's something completely different like DeepIn or something we're not even thinking of. But the point being, they get onboarded through this new ecosystem or L1 that can only power that use case. They have no reason to even understand all the stuff that happened before it. And that's kind of how we can arrive at these conclusions that we're driving towards, this path independent sort of conclusion.
Yeah, totally.
From your report, which I thought was really interesting, you talked about the NFT compression, and it was really, really interesting. And I'd love you to go in and talk us through it. But you've compared it to sort of two other ecosystems. And I think it's maybe been difficult so far to conceptualize what exactly is happening with NFT compression on Solana, because instinctively you see it and it does seem very, very impressive. It feels completely new to anything we've seen before. And yet it's hard to say, is this possible in other chains? Is this going to be rolled out on every chain in the next few months because there's this unlock, or is it something which is hashtag only possible on Solana? So it'd be great if you could just talk through your findings around the subject.
Yeah, so a couple things. One, on the point of is this going to be rolled out on, n number of different chains, there are some tech constraints that stop that from being feasible on a lot of chains. Particularly, to like in parallel kind of manage the state of, a million NFTs. Number one, even if you are able to sort of mint that many NFTs, if everything is happening sequentially, like you see on EVM chains, for example, you can't like even process attempts to alter the state of those NFTs in parallel. They'd all have to happen sequentially. Whereas on Solana, let's say you have a million NFTs owned by the three of us, and Sal's trying to dump his third on the two of us. And we're all trying to dump at the same time, Like the chain is at least able to process all of that in parallel and then order like in sequential because we're all trying to alter the same state, like who was first or who paid the highest fee or whatever. But the initial top of the funnel aspect can happen in parallel, and you can only really do that, at least in my understanding, on like parallel processing chains like Solana, Sui, Aptos, etc. And so in terms of like the unlock or like why it's important or why should people be excited, I think ultimately it's true in most businesses that whenever you reduce the cost for your customers to do things with your product, the usage and the variance of use cases will increase. And so, like, let's say, maybe in 1995, I wasn't around, but you might be able to record a video of yourself and post it to the internet. But the cost to do that and the functionality of that was extremely limited. And so, if you built some startup around that idea, it would go straight to zero at that time. You fast forward like 10, 15 years later when the cost to render videos and to store them online and all of these things decreases by 1 trillion% or whatever. And what do you get? You get a YouTube, which is, as we all know, it's one of the best businesses in history, in part due to those cost savings, the ensuing accessibility, and then finally, the users being able to come in and just experiment because it's next to free. And so coming back to compression, we've had over the last 2, 3 years excitement around NFTs generally. In terms of what's actually been done on chain, it's mostly been focused on this PFP stuff, in large part because most of the minters, like in terms of making back the fairly large upfront costs that you had to pay to mint this stuff, the only way to do that with any level of reliability was through this sort of PFP or art or selling collectibles in general. And so that's what's like been done, but what's been theorized is a whole host of different use cases. The ticketing and the longevity IP is one, and like there's just an unlimited number, fashion, all these different things, right? And regardless of whether or not these use cases are actually legitimate, because we don't know because they haven't been tried, you need a level of technology that enables you to actually try them. And then you find out, is this good? Is this bad? Should we keep iterating on this or should we just drop it? And that's what I feel like state compression allows, where you're dropping the issuance costs of these NFTs from, in some cases, hundreds of thousands or millions, and you're dropping it down to the hundreds range. And so, those are things that small new startups can afford. So that's kind of my long-winded synopsis.
Yeah, no, and the thing that you brought up there with the NFT stuff is it reminds me so much of the kind of 2017, early 2018 ICO boom, where everyone had these pie in the sky ideas, but it turns out it's actually really hard to build a lot of this stuff, and we needed years of infra development to make some of them possible. And I see this cycle repeating itself with NFTs, where we want to change ticketing and fashion and collectibles. But it turns out it's hard to do them at scale. They're expensive to mint. There's also the wallet side and the consumer side. It's a little bit harder because NFTs even are more on chain than some early products in other crypto applications, like centralized exchanges, right? Like you don't necessarily need to make a wallet, but if you want to buy a Bored Ape, you do, and you have to figure out how to do all that stuff as a consumer. And I think one of your points in the tweet summary you did was the only way to run Web2 business models on chain without spending Masayoshi Son levels of cash is that we got to make it cheaper with things like NFT compression and other advances that I think Solana is leading the charge on. It's interesting you brought up a couple of other ecosystems. I'm just curious from your perspective, like as a researcher Messari, I'm sure there's other analysts with different opinions about things and ecosystems they like. Like, how would you kind of create this taxonomy of the design space for blockchains? Like, is it ETH, and then there's maybe EVM stuff that's inheriting ETH security, like an L2, and then there's maybe like EVM chains that are siloed off, like Monad, like. And then obviously you brought up Aptos and Sui and like Solana, which are just their own execution environments. Like, how do you guys think about this broader taxonomy?
Yeah, and so I mean, I think at the highest level, you have the common like sort of modular versus integrated kind of approaches. So on the modular side, you have dominance mainly by Ethereum, with the sort of outside bets, if you will, being mainly focused on like Cosmos, Celestia kind of things, I were to say. And then on the integrated side, you have Solana being like the primary player of focus from a mindshare perspective. And I think there's also people who recognize the technological intrigue of Aptos, Sui, and maybe even like Say and some others. But from a ecosystem perspective, it's just a bit too early to tell as to whether or not those will have the same level of sticking power. And so I think that's why you see comparatively less interest.
Launched at very interesting times, right? Kind of the end of the bull market, beginning of the bear market, where Solana was like solidly in in the depths of a bear market. I would be interested too to see how those ecosystems play out with the kind of the valuations they're raised at and expectations on investor sides too.
It's not just the tech. It's like all startups, really. You need the luck, don't you? You need to, as Solana did, literally launched like the week of the absolute bottom of the bear, and then you can crawl along at a tiny valuation and then make everyone wealthy, basically. Ethereum obviously did similar, whereas Aptos, SUI basically raised at the top of the bull from big VCs, and therefore are forced, if you like, to offer these enormous starting valuations. So yeah, it's an uphill struggle just purely by the timing, as you say.
How do you think about like the valuing the token itself? I know there's like a section where you introduce this framework that I think Multicoins took a stab at initially. Maybe kind of give us your thoughts and takeaways from that, how you thought about even valuing an L1 like Solana.
Yeah, so I think like most of the space is somewhat converged on this sort of sum of the parts or triple point asset, or it's gone by various different names. But that's roughly what multi-coins framework looked like, which I really liked. And so just to summarize, you basically look at L1s as a hybrid of three different asset types: your capital asset, which is like a stock; a commodity asset like oil; and then as a money asset, like maybe a treasury or dollar bill, whatever. And then you can try and look at those different components and see, like, all right, how much, like, how high do I think this capital value component can get, or what do I think the baseline is like, or what do I think, how high do I think the commodity value can get based off of transaction demand, or other things like that. And so there's a lot of customization that can happen at the like specific layer of how you want to architect, how you measure each one of those three components. But I think at a high level, it's an accurate framework. I guess the debate then comes as to how do you actually measure each component? What assumptions do you make? Because slight tweaks in those can lead to pretty drastic changes in the end results that you get.
One kind of interesting takeaway I noticed when you did this analysis is that it'll take about 350x the transaction count to reach this equilibrium point where like the issuance of Sol outweighs fee burns. And it seems like to get to that, we would need something like a fire dancer or some kind of additional innovation to make that happen. So does it seem like the central thesis here is that for Sol to be valuable, it requires like a massive kind of upstep in transaction count? But incidentally, it seems like the only like that's kind of the whole point of Solana is like it's a high performance chain.
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say like that's a necessary condition for Sol to be valuable. I guess the way that I would say it is that's a necessary condition for just for the issuance of the token to be in equilibrium with like the burn pressure on the token. So that doesn't necessarily make it valuable, or if it doesn't hit that, it doesn't necessarily make it not valuable. It's just balancing the supply and demand of the token. And to your point of the feasibility of it with Fire Dancer, yeah, I mean, the projections that we talked about earlier in the show and that the team has talked about and what they're generally building towards, it does provide that increase in transactions. And it doesn't even have to be purely the transaction side that goes up, it can also be the fee side. And so Solana right now is like a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a penny type level fees. And so at least I would assume you can pretty safely, let's say 4x that component and then 100x the transactions, you get to the same end result. So yeah, a lot of different ways it can be spun, but I think my big takeaway from that sort of thought experiment, because again, the numbers are subject to change and the inflation rate is changing and who knows what they do with the fees and all these other things. But my big takeaway is that in the Ethereum landscape, you have this big narrative of ultrasound money and net negative issuance. And for what it's worth, I think that's a good narrative. And I think it's, you know, maybe good token design. But the way that they got there is through very high fees, like prohibitively high fees for most use cases. Forget about just, retail ape can't buy Pepe, but, like even, your we talked earlier about high frequency trading. Of course, like the TPS doesn't allow for it, but even if it did, the fees would be too high to be canceling and re-uploading bids on chain like that, even at the L2 or maybe even L3 level with Ethereum. And so Solana can get to that same net negative issuance, albeit with this massive raise in transactions, maybe coupled with a slight raise in fees. And it can still retain also the property of having very low fees for whoever the user is, farmer in Zimbabwe or top hedge fund trader in on Wall Street, So that I found particularly interesting.
You've mentioned in your sort of ETH versus Solana what they could both improve upon. You said Solana needs to find applications basically which are only possible on Solana, which leverage its speed and its low latency and its high throughput, whereas Ethereum needs to find, because obviously it's found a degree of product market fit, but as you were just alluding to, only in really highly speculative use cases where you can justify, fees ranging from a few dollars to a few $1,000s. In my mind, though, potentially those applications could be the same sorts of things. These only possible on Solana applications and non-speculative applications on Ethereum. So I was just wondering if you've got any feeling, man on the inside, what we might see next bull market, and are we going to see something different than we're expecting right now? Will it be stuff we saw last bull market, but extension of it?
Yeah, I'm honored to be called a man on the inside. I don't
more
think I've
so than
gotten
me.
there quite yet. But look, I try, and I know I kind of bash on the idea of historical reference and like anchoring too heavily on that. But I do think that there's value just in observing the history of the space and trying to draw out any kind of insight that you can from that. And I think what we've seen post bear markets in the past is that the new bull market like takes ideas that failed in the bear market and with some new infrastructure turns them into ideas that are relatively successful. And so in 2017, you had like Ether Delta, for example, which is like,
Yep.
the to my
OG.
understanding, the earliest DEX. I
It was
wasn't
so
there,
ugly.
so I can't claim it,
It
but
wasn't
like,
good. It wasn't
you
good.
know, yeah, doesn't sound from all accounts I've heard, it wasn't the best experience. But you fast forward to 2021, like even forget about where it is now, but even by 2021, you had a plethora of dexes with different designs that actually worked really well. You had Uniswap and you had Balancer. Of course, those things were founded earlier than 2021, but like their rise to glory was in that bull market. And so, fast forwarding to now, I guess like I don't have the answer, or I'd probably be on an island somewhere with a stack of cash. I would be looking for ideas that maybe made sense in 2021 but failed or didn't really gain adoption or haven't really gained adoption yet. But with maybe some of these infrastructure improvements we're talking about by 2024 or 2025, can become really compelling and, in turn, hopefully gain a lot of adoption.
Totally. I actually love that comparison. It's like Ether Delta compared to Uniswap is similar to like Palm Pilot compared to iPhone. If you just compare the experience for the user in the front end and what you see and like how easy it is to use it. And I think I agree. I think what's interesting about chains like Solana is you can almost see the writing on the wall where these use cases we talk about where, let's just use ticketing, for example. If you're a company that needs to, I don't know, issue out 10,000 tickets for your audience. Like just run the experiment right now. Just try doing it on Matic, try doing it on ETH, try doing it on some other L2, and then try doing it on Solana and just measure how much the business has to spend to do it and how fast it is. It's my view that you'll see a pretty big performance difference, and where like things like DeFi liquidity is probably not that important for a ticket to see, some EDM artists at a festival. That's kind of what excites me about ecosystems like Solana, where like I can see how it works already today, and it's only going to get easier as things like compressed NFT standards continue to evolve over time. So I don't know. There's like other use cases I think similar to that, on the gaming side too, where the design space is just so much more amenable to like scalable applications where you need to do a lot of things on chain, and you either don't want to burden the user by paying for all these gas fees, or you want to kind of make the UI as simple as possible. And I think, yes, it's possible to do it on an L2, but it just introduces complexities, and you don't necessarily get the performance gains too. There's almost like a cap there, whereas Solana not only has headroom on the TPS front, if the protocol needs to change things, there's headroom on like what they could do to just parameters like the fee, and like, okay, we could increase it 10x and it's still really cheap.
It's interesting. I just wrote down a list of things, just so we can get our alpha group going, the alpha investing group going. So 5 things I've written down from the last bull market that I think, had a little bit of impetus, but never really got going. So I'd say social, gaming, albeit it did have a run up, but it was slightly ponzonomic. Brands coming online, deep in, and real world assets. And I would say the thing which sort of joins all of those is NFTs and is being able to mint high levels of very cheap NFTs. If you want to do real world assets, deep in, we just saw it with Helium. They made all of their hotspots, 1 million hotspots as NFTs. Brands, if you want every single handbag that you sell to be also represented in an NFT, gaming and social. So you were just talking about you need new infrastructure in order to further these early experiments in the previous bull market. And it comes back to this idea of the compressed NFTs or the experiments occurring on some of the other chains, which may be the unlock for a load of those new industries. And looking at social, because you compared in your graph sort of Solana versus what's happening over with Leinster, and is it Momoka on L3? So again, it's not something we've covered really on this podcast, but I was just wondering if you had any information really on how they're going about it, and I don't know what the trade-offs really are going to be between trying to do something like a huge social ecosystem on an L3 versus on an L1.
Sure. So the big difference so the comparison that you're talking about is between Lens Momoka, which is this L3 that you described, and there's also Alt Layer, which is like a kind of roll up on demand kind of service where, let's say you want to do an NFT mint, in 5 minutes, they'll spin up a roll up in 4 minutes and 59 seconds, mint all those NFTs on this roll up. And then once the mint is done, post the state back to the, either RL2 or if it's from L1, whatever the underlying first layer was. And then the third was state compression. And what all of these attempt to do to varying degrees is like minting, like lower the cost of minting and lower the cost of like managing. And so managing is after you've minted these assets, what are you going to do with them? And minting, of course, is when you create these assets. And the reason why I came to the conclusion that state compression was the best in comparison was that it was like the savings that you get from a cost perspective are retained post mint. And so with alt layer, they're not retained. You mint in this cheap area over here, then you post all the state back to this expensive area. If you need to now do things with those NFTs, that cost is still prohibitively high. And so that kind of knocked that one out. And then on the lens side, Momoka isn't really an asset issuance scaling platform. So it doesn't scale the cost of, or rather reduce the cost of, let's say, issuing posts on chain or issuing likes on chain or any of these other social interactions. It just scales the throughput of being able to, you know, if you have like likes or something like that, and there's, we used the World Cup example, I think earlier, like Twitter had like 25K TPS during, the World Cup final. And so Lens scales to roughly that same number. And so these interactions, which are not like NFTs stored on chain, is just like kind of transactions, and the data is stored off chain. It's stored on Arweave. It just scales the speed at which those transactions can be propagated. Whereas before they're on, I think, Polygon L2, so they're constrained by whatever the TPS of the Polygon POS chain was, maybe in the hundreds.
I've actually thought a lot about these decentralized social graph protocols, and I've used some of them built on things like Lens Protocol and Farcaster. Obviously, I think Selkis put out a tweet recently showing like daily engagements are up 11x on Lens specifically since September. So it seems like there is some traction. I think a lot of it is enabled by their transition over to this L3, where perhaps they were bottlenecked a bit by the performance of Polygon before. But like, how do you see? We recently saw Threads, this great experiment that Meta put out, and like Twitter has kind of been having some turbulence recently. How do you see this playing out on the social side? Do we share the view that Web3 might have an answer here, or is it a lot of it just kind of, I don't know, out of touch with how people use social? I definitely have some views on this too, but curious to hear yours.
I go back and forth on this. I think social is really hard. And it's really hard to get users by offering the same product in a different way. And so even like in the case of Instagram, people will cite like Reels, which is like their version of TikTok effectively, as a success case for why you can do this. But I think anyone who uses Instagram will be able to tell you the staleness of Reels in comparison to the freshness of TikTok, because the vast majority of the activity is on TikTok, where they're constantly showing you like the newest stuff and the hottest things, whereas Instagram, there's not even enough creators for them to show you a constant stream of new things. They're showing you 3 day old, 7 day, 5 week old things on a regular basis. I know this as an Instagram addict, like
Yeah.
so. And like even in the case of Threads, which is the more sort of hot example, what we saw is this initial sort of boom. But I think I saw a graph just earlier today of the Google
Yeah.
Trends search interests, and it's
We
dropped
saw the
off a
same graph.
cliff. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think a core to the Web3 social thesis, at least to my understanding of it, is this idea that like, you know, portability is very important in terms of like I have this social graph and I can bring it into all these different apps that do slightly different versions of the same thing. Um, and I think, with the case of Threads, having that social graph portability effectively from whoever you followed on Instagram into like a Twitter clone effectively, it didn't really, or at least it hasn't yet really translated to this sort of boom and adoption. Didn't matter at all. And this is with the company that has the greatest distribution, maybe of all companies ever, So like port it to Web3, it's like, I'm not so sure.
I had this view for a while now that that core value prop you just described is completely meaningless. The decentralization and portability of your social graph. Like, trust me, I've literally never downloaded a social app because I wanted to bring my friends over from a different social app. In fact, I do the exact opposite. I used to use social app to have a different circle of people. Like, I don't want my mom to see me on Snapchat. You know what I mean? Like, they have different use cases, they're different utility. And kind of to your point about Reels, like, yeah, I noticed the same thing. Like Reels and YouTube Shorts too, they just rehypothecate TikTok at some lag, whether it's a few days, a few weeks, the trendiest videos. And you'll even see like in YouTube Shorts, the guy that's doing the TikTok is like, "What's up, TikTok? Here are my views on this." Right? Like, it's hilarious, and that should be a lesson for all of us builders in Web3. Like, this is what a portable social graph looks like, where one creator makes one format video for all the platforms, and then all the platforms figure out how they want to distribute it to their audiences. Now, look, it's not to say shorts and reels aren't successful, because they are. Like, people watch them, they use them, and all the metrics are probably good. But I am a little suspicious of like leading with that use case. I think it's a different sort of scenario where they were just kind of copying this feature that worked well on TikTok. But these platforms already have an audience for a different reason. Like we have the Instagram main feed where you have all your pictures, you have YouTube and the videos themselves. They're not going to YouTube for shorts, which is just a worse version of TikTok, to your point. And the other point I'll make on this, and I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts, is you have to follow what creators are doing, which is, just look at like the logical extreme of this. Mr. Beast, 150 million plus subs on YouTube. His focus is distribution and the algorithm, right? Like, I don't think he's ever talked about this idea of, I got to be able to bring my subscribers along for the ride. He doesn't have enough subscribers to like hit his view goals, honestly. I mean, now he does, but maybe a year ago he didn't. The Squid Game video did like 250 million views. At the time, he probably had tens of millions of subs, right? Like, the point is, he built that video for the distribution YouTube offers. That is the only thing I think creators care about at the end of the day. And crypto kind of social providers might benefit from kind of learning some of these lessons that we already had from traditional social and step out of the Twitter kind of bubble, which I think has been the most problematic social network. And that's kind of where a lot of the ideation comes from. But there's plenty of other social networks that no one's really complaining about.
And would you say, is your point basically we can't rely on sort of skeuomorphic, looking back to the past and just trying to recreate a Web3 equivalent of a Web2 app? It needs to be something completely native, really, to Web3. I mean, I think dialect, it's just really, really hard, isn't it, to conceptualize what exactly it is that crypto is going to give you. Something to do with the transfer of value in some way, it feels like. That seems to me the more practical, unique proposition. And I mean, that is something which Dialect are doing. I don't know if you've seen, but they're using smart messaging basically within the app to be able to send people money directly to their wallet. So stuff like that. But yeah, it's very hard. I don't know if you've got any thoughts, Cal or Sal, on what that could look like.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think dialect is a good example of like integrating like features that are non-skeuomorphic to your point. And so maybe the like original, it's similar to a telegram or something like that. And you can say it's skeuomorphic in that sense. But then when you add the sort of, smart contract execution with, one click or one command within the app, that is, a significant enough divergence, I guess, that provides actual value to like a set of users that exists, right? In this case, it's people who use crypto, who use Solana, who also use messaging, and you want to do an NFT mint to a group of subscribers, that could become the best way to do that. And if you imagine a world in which more people are doing that, so the top of your funnel is increasing, and you imagine a world where dialect gets better at doing that, then you can kind of see how an app like dialect at least has a chance of, carving out a legitimate market for itself and then expanding from there. And so I guess it's kind of different to, we've talked about like Lens and like Farcaster, where I feel like the core value proposition is more so about the openness of the data, which I do think in a end state can be valuable, but the path dependent aspect is kind of important in terms of like how do you get valuable data on there. If the data is open but it's dog water, then like it doesn't really matter. And when there's so much noise in your data from just crypto being crypto, then from the incremental creator's perspective, I'll still rather go to centralized platform, even if they can rug me. At the least, I know that before they rug me, that their targeting is super good. The data they have is incredibly good and incredibly granular too. That's another aspect that somewhat weighs in Solana's favor with these social networks, is that the granularity of data that you can get to on an EVM network is quite low in terms of social usage, because you can't like, I'll just take Lens and Gum, which is kind of similar to Lens, but on Solana. Gum posts way more information about your usage on chain via using compression than Lens does onto Polygon without compression, because the cost to do it on Polygon is relatively high. And so Lens will only put like your posts on chain, maybe your comments, your retweets, or like they have different names for it, but that's effectively what it is. Whereas on the Gum side, they'll put all of that stuff too, but then they'll also put like your reactions, your likes, etc. And as we know, like with these social networks, algorithmic search, like you need more and more information to get better and better recommendations for the users. And as of right now, I mean, neither of these two solutions have it, but at the very least, you can imagine a world where you can actually put that information on chain on the Solana side because the cost would be low enough to do it.
What are you excited about looking forward now? It seems like the sentiment in crypto is kind of turning a corner. It's on an upward trajectory. What excites you about the Solana ecosystem, whether it's narratives, trends, or even specific projects building?
I think what I want to see is experimentation with the new infrastructure. I think that's what, powers these bull markets, and that's what powers these increases in adoption that we've talked about. And, Dave, you outlined all of these different use cases, gaming, social, deepen, etc. And we start to see the beginning of experimentation there, but I really want to see, 12 months from now, what have people done? What have people built, and have we discovered that use case? Is it one of the ones we've already outlined? Is it some remix of one of the ones we've already outlined, or is it something completely new? And I think especially if we get to a world where Fire Dancer launches, within the next year or 2 years, and then you combine that with some of these other upgrades we didn't even really, we discussed, of course, state compression, I think is the biggest one. But there's other ones as well that, local fee markets, etc. And just trying to see like, all right, like what do people actually build now that they have this in a similar fashion to, what we've seen in the past? What do people actually build when they have some of these DeFi primitives? If you couldn't predict a yearn 2017 before there was, any Aave compound, etc. And so that's what I want to see.
Well, it seems like there's already some alpha packed into that response alone. But thank you for joining us, Kel. Tons of insights, and looking forward to reading more of the great research you put out.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.